Walsh, the Assistant Director at Trusting News. I want to talk to you about how you can avoid polarization in your political coverage, and especially your election coverage. Unfortunately, we know that topics like elections and politics can divide people and divide communities. As journalists, we hope that that isn't your goal, and that instead you want to provide people with information that can help them, that can empower them, and that can encourage them to talk with one another, to find solutions, and to understand what they are voting on. To do that, we want to cover first a couple commonalities that exist among people who have low trust in news, but specifically in political coverage. Often, those people feel flattened out or overgeneralized. They feel misunderstood or that coverage leaves them out. They also feel like journalism is not made for or by people like them. And they stop tuning into journalism and news because it feels irrelevant. If people are tuning out of our news coverage, where are they going to get information? Are those sources of information trustworthy, accurate? To make sure that they are, let's try to work to make our news content less polarizing. And so I'm going to go through some ways we can do that. The first way is to think about how journalism can highlight complexity and fuel curiosity, not polarization. One way we can do this is by highlighting moderate voices. Often journalists highlight the most extreme voices or the sensationalized comment from the lawmaker. What if instead we work to look at the moderate perspective? Another thing we can do is stop overgeneralizing. The number one complaint we have heard in some research we've done on this polarization topic is that people feel like their views are lumped all together and overgeneralized. They're put into a bucket that we want them to fit into. But often their views are much more complex than that, especially when it comes to topics like abortion or immigration. It's also important to make sure that your opinion coverage is labeled properly and that that label travels from your page or from the video when it is shared elsewhere on social media or other platforms. People have a hard time distinguishing between news and opinion. When that happens, they make an assumption that your opinion content is news content and then may assume that you have a bias based on it. We have two tools that can also help you eliminate polarization in your news content. The first is focused on word choice. We know that the words we use matter, and they can mean different things to different people, and can lead to people making assumptions about your news coverage, which can lead to this polarization. You can use this checklist to look at words that you might want to reconsider using altogether. For example, there are certain words that may spice up a story, but they also convey a perspective or attitude. Things like thwart, claim, words that add to this idea that politics is about fighting in a battle. What if we instead eliminated that? Another thing you can do is look at small words that can give away your own assumptions. Supposed, so-called, only, just, even. Another question we can ask ourselves if we want to avoid adding polarization to our news content is how can we root our coverage in the experiences of the people we aim to serve? So the idea here is to ask people what they want the candidates to be focusing on. You may have heard of this approach called the citizen's agenda. We also can ask people what led them to their beliefs and focus on their humanity. Another thing we can do is ask better questions. Don't ask people if the election was fair. Save that for election security experts. Instead, ask regular people questions that will help the audience understand what motivates their views. The idea is to dwell on the complexity and the nuance of people's answers because people are nuanced and have complex views. We also don't want to solely rely on our curiosities as journalists. The reason being, journalists aren't always as diverse as the communities they serve. We want to work on this diversity. We also need to make sure that we realize this is the case and in our coverage, find ways to make up for that lack of diversity. Maybe that's by including more community perspectives. We also have an anti-polarization checklist. This checklist is supposed to be used as a guide for journalists throughout the reporting process. The goal is to help journalists look at things like headline framing, story framing, word choice, and the sources represented in the story. When journalists have used this, they have said it has helped them add more context to stories, frame stories to be focused more on solutions, and also take a more careful look at their word choice. The other thing you can do is make sure to listen to people in your community on a regular basis. We have created a community listening guide that helps guide journalists through questions they can ask community members, not when they need something for a story, but just when they are talking to them in general to better get to know who their community members are and for the community members to get to know the journalist. It's something that can build trust between the community member, the newsroom, and the journalist. It's important as we talk about eliminating polarization in our news content that we recognize the role we play as journalists. We have to understand that we are considered part of the media. That is a term that some people may instantly distrust. We also have to understand that being a news consumer is complicated nowadays. By understanding all of this, we're coming at the relationship between journalists and news consumers with empathy and with humility. If you want more tips on showing empathy and showing humility in your reporting, check out the Trust Kits on our website. We also have more examples of how to avoid polarization in your news coverage, whether that's election, political coverage, or other coverage. In addition, we have our weekly newsletter that provides tips on all of those topics related to election coverage and political coverage